Broadcasting from the world headquarters of the National Floor Safety Institute is America's slip and fall guy, Russ.
This is America's Slip and Fall Guy, Russ Kenzior. Thanks for listening to my podcast. It's been said that if you want to know how we got to where we are, we have to understand those who came before us and the contributions they made. And in the field of public safety, there are few people who've made a greater impact than Ralph Nader. Joining me today is a former presidential candidate, best-selling author, and advocate for public safety, Ralph Nader. Ralph, thanks for coming to the program today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, it all kind of started for me back in the 1965 when you released your first book on auto safety, Unsafe at Any Speed, the designed-in dangers of the American automobile, which I remember reading, Ralph, as a young man. And my older sister actually owned a Corvair, and remember her bragging about how quick it was and how speedy it was, but also how unpredictable it was, Ralph, and uncontrollable. Yes. When steering at high speed. So, let's go back in time a little bit. That was 54 years ago, and for an audience today that may not remember the contributions you made as an advocate for public safety, take a moment just to kind of refresh everybody. What was that all about? What was Unsafe at Any Speed about? What was the issue back then, Ralph?
Well, in those days, the auto companies sold horsepower and style, psychosexual appeals. They didn't sell fuel efficiency. They didn't sell crash protection. They didn't sell better brakes and tires. They didn't sell less pollution in your lungs from these motor vehicles. They were in a technologically stagnant period of automotive history. And I did a paper at Harvard Law School on unsafe auto design and the lack of mandatory safety standards by the federal and state governments. And I turned it into a book a few years later, Unsafe at Any Speed. And General Motors got wind of this, and they hired private detectives to follow me everywhere to get dirt on me, as the instructions in the detective memo was. And they made the mistake of following me down to the U.S. Senate, where I was slated to be a witness at a hearing on auto safety, and that triggered a federal law, which is intimidating a congressional witness is a serious felony. Anyway, the guard caught them following me, and all the press just started covering it in 1966 heavily. We had big Senate hearings, and within a few months, unlike today, the biggest industry in the country was regulated by the federal government for fuel efficiency, but mostly for crash safety and operational safety under the newly minted Department of Transportation. And the result over the last 54 years has been well over 3.5 million saved lives in the U.S. alone. And, of course, overseas, because the foreign manufacturers had to meet U.S. standards if they wanted to sell in the U.S. market. So they built safer cars and put in seat belts, padded dash panels, head restraints, side impact protection. And, of course, a little later came the airbags. And the U.S. caught up with Western Europe on tires and brakes. And so we now have about 1.5 deaths per 100 million vehicle miles traveled in the U.S. compared to about 5.7 deaths per 100 million vehicle miles traveled in 1966.
So you were a threat. You were a threat. What was it that General Motors and probably the entire automobile industry were threatened by? I mean, what was it that you did to scare them?
They didn't want to be sued because they wanted everybody who was injured or killed in motor vehicles and next of kin to think it was all the driver's fault. So they went to the insurance companies and they negotiated settlements. And it was at that time never seen to be the motor vehicle manufacturer's contribution to the crash and the death. The second thing they were really afraid of was federal regulation.
Well, funny in my field, as you know, it's the same thing. I mean, people slip and fall, get hurt, and they always want to blame the victim. Why don't you watch where you're walking? It's always your fault, never the manufacturer of the floor's fault. A lot of similar parallels. Now, in your book, you dedicated it to a gentleman by the name of Frederick Hughes Condon. Who was he, and what was his level of importance, Ralph, that you dedicated your book to?
Well, he was my law school classmate at Harvard Law School, and 4 years or so after he got out, he was working for an insurance company in New Hampshire, and he was driving home one night, and he had worked late, and he fell asleep just temporarily at the wheel. There were no seatbelts in cars then, and his car rolled over, and he was rendered a paraplegic, and he had 4 children. And his wife heard about the crash, rushed in her car to him, and he looked up at her. He said, "Look, I may be badly injured, but my head is okay." And he was a great father and husband, and overcame so many of the handicaps to live a fruitful life until his mid-70s.
Wow.
So I dedicated it to him because his injury would have been prevented with seatbelts.
Right, right. You know, a lot of people would ask, why would you want to take on General Motors? What was motivating you, Ralph, back in the mid-1960s to really champion this cause? I mean, it'd be a lot easier, right, to just say, hey, it's not my problem, doesn't affect me, maybe work within the industry, come up with a compromise. But you took them on, head on. I mean, you went all the way to Congress. And what was your motivation? What is it that you were really motivated by?
Well, it was the leading cause of death in my age group, 5 to 24, and I saw a lot of seriously injured classmates in high school and college. Some of them died, and I began researching it, and I found that a lot of the injuries could have been prevented or diminished in severity with very simple safety devices, some of which I've just mentioned, some of which were patented by the auto companies decades ago, but they never put them in cars because they were selling style and horsepower, and they didn't want to be bothered. And that really got me angry, just the way you're angry about slip and falls that are preventable in terms of injuries and worse. And I didn't say someone else is going to do it. I said, no one is doing it, I'm going to do it.
Yeah, well, I feel like we're brothers separated by time. You know, Chapter 8, you only had 8 chapters in Unsafe at Any Speed and 2 appendix. But I really found the last chapter, Chapter 8, which you entitled The Coming Struggle for Safety. I mean, you were in many ways quite a visionary because you kind of foresaw that this was going to open a lot more doors, a lot bigger issues for multiple industries. What was really the thought that you had behind that chapter 8?
Well, I didn't like the idea that a few auto companies could decide who lives and who dies on the highway by cutting corners, suppressing their safety engineers, elevating their stylists, and selling horsepower, speed, and, in effect, recklessness. I mean, they would have ads saying, when you get behind this 400 horsepower automobile, you have your own nuclear deterrent. I mean, that's the kind of goading that their promotion was involved in. I said, we can't have that in a democracy. Human life is too precious, and we have to have democratic control where the federal government would say to the auto companies, you're not going to get away with this. You're going to put some simple life-saving safety devices and engineering features in your cars, and you're going to save a lot of lives and injuries in spite of your greed because we're going to force you to do it. And if you don't do it, we're going to prosecute you. And as a collateral benefit, motorists would pay less in auto insurance, in addition to avoiding all kinds of tragedies and family anguish.
You know, I learned a lot about you from your 2007 book, The 17 Traditions, which was really kind of I don't know, is it a biography? It really tells your story, how you grew up, your family, growing up in Winsted, Connecticut, and your relationship with your mother and father and your brother and your sister. And one of the things that I actually recall and highlighted in your book is the statement you made where you said, listening doesn't always mean remaining silent. I learned early that good listening meant asking leading questions and inserting verbal nudges that would tease out what you were really interested in learning. And that's a quote that, again, resonates with me because, sometimes companies that are, well, in the case of the automobile industry, they'll say things that they really didn't mean to say, but if you listen to them, it kind of takes you down a different path. And I think you walk down that path where simply pursuing a line of questioning just continued to expose more and more built-in defects that the Corvair had, and frankly, Ralph, many other cars in their day had, not just the Corvair, but that 2007 book, The 17 Traditions, is one that really echoed with me. Safety is not a particularly sexy subject. Most people, kind of take product safety, automobile safety, floor safety for granted. Until, of course, something bad happens to them. Maybe a life-threatening automobile crash like what happened to Mr. Condon, or just an average slip and fall that really debilitates a person. And then, of course, they hire an attorney. You have also founded the American Museum of Tort Law, located in your hometown of Winsted, Connecticut. And, the motivation, the selflessness is, educating, informing, inspiring Americans about, the jury system, the trial by jury, the benefits of tort law. People take that for granted, Ralph. They don't quite understand how valuable, tort law protects wrongful injuries, motor vehicle crashes, slips and falls, medical malpractice. And so spend a little time walking us through the museum, the purpose behind it, and where you're going.
Well, you've made a lot of points. 17 Traditions is the story of how my parents raised their 4 children in the 1930s and 40s and 50s in a industrial town in northwest Connecticut, Winsted, Connecticut. I often joked it's the only book I've ever written that everybody loves, and it still is a perennial seller, published by HarperCollins. And young parents just love it because in a non-lecturing way, it tells stories and about what upbringing is all about. And it never really changes that much. Parents want their kids to listen. They want them to do their chores. They want them to be curious. They want them to do all the things, regardless of the new technologies. And the second point is that corporate technology was running wild. I mean, you had occupational deaths and diseases in factories and foundries and agricultural field. In those days, Russell, actually people were less safety concerned. It was, that's the way the ball bounces. It's written, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Well, people are much more safety conscious because of consumer advocates like you, for example, have made them much more conscious about floors that are very prone to slipping, or floors that have friction built in and can reduce slips and falls, not to mention the design of shoes these days. But I think people and families and parents are much more safety conscious. So, just to look at baseball. When I was growing up, there were no helmets, there were no gloves, there were no padded walls. Players would bang into walls and get concussions and be carried off the field, sometimes permanently damaged. And now we take those things totally for granted, like we take seatbelts for granted, like we take no smoking in airlines and buses and trains and hospital waiting rooms and classes and universities. People just smoke all the time, everywhere. And now we just take it for granted. But if it ever came back, people would be pretty outraged and they'd protest. So we thought that the last remaining awareness was the law of torts. And people would say, what is the law of torts? And I said, well, it's the law of wrongful injury, which affects you more than any other kind of law, including criminal law. because everybody's exposed to watching, seeing, experimenting, or experiencing wrongful injury. They can be bullied on the streets as children. They can be sexually assaulted. They can be exposed to toxic chemicals. They can be hurt in defectively constructed cars. They can be exposed to flammable fabrics in their clothing. They can be subjected to medical malpractice. I mean, Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine estimated that 5,000 people a week, repeat, 5,000 people a week in the United States die due to preventable conditions in hospitals. Never mind just clinics and doctors' offices, just in hospitals. That's more than a 9/11 every week. And you can imagine how many preventable injuries and illnesses there would be. So we opened this law museum in September 2015. It's the only law museum of any kind in the entire world. And people come from all over the world to visit it because we have the best tort law system, the law of wrongful injury. Somebody injures you wrongfully, you can go to a contingent fee lawyer, have your day in court, trial by jury. Most people don't know that, so they don't use the rights they have to get adequately compensated for their injuries and expenses and to deter unsafe conditions in the future by the manufacturer or the producer of the dangerous condition. So on October 5th, Saturday, all day, starting at 11 a.m. in Winsted, Connecticut, we're going to have the first National Tort Law Education Day, and we hope it spreads to similar days in cities all over the country in subsequent years. So if you're interested, just go to tortmuseum.org, get the details, time, place, tortmuseum.org, and you'll see what an educational experience this is. We're trying to get it taught rudimentally in high schools, even middle schools. Kids can understand this, just as they can understand your whole program for slip and fall. If we educate youngsters about their legal rights, they will be part of a movement to make wrongdoers pay, and they'll be less likely to engage in wrongdoers in the future because it costs them more to be wrongdoers than to be safe doers.
Well, a lot of people so easily, our fellow citizens, relinquish their rights, Ralph. They don't vote. They don't participate in the political system. They seem to be tuned out generally. And then when something bad happens to them, they're outraged. And, there was a time where there was no OSHA, there was no ADA, there was not a Consumer Product Safety Commission, meaning government agencies, regulators, to look out for the public's well-being. And it's been pioneers like yourself and others that really brought that to a place in our culture where we just take it for granted. But back to the whole subject of slips and falls. It's one that I've committed my life to, the prevention of those types of injuries. And it's just amazing the parallels, Ralph, between how manufacturers of floors openly oppose and just fight us on every front. Our petition, our first petition to the Consumer Product Safety Commission back in 2015 was turned down, a close vote, 3-2. And it was a labeling standard. It was simply requiring manufacturers of floors to test their products to a national standard, the ANSI B101.1 and B101.3 coefficient of friction standards, and then properly label their products for the benefit of the consumer so the consumer knows when they're about to make a selection for a particular floor, just how slippery is it. And it's a gas gauge. You've seen it, Ralph. It looks like a gas gauge type of a label. And it just shocked me how pretty much every manufacturer of floors, ceramic, vinyl, laminate, wood, just going down the list, they openly opposed testing and labeling of their products. And, we thought, well, all right, maybe we need to refine the petition. So we resubmitted it in 2018, addressed a lot of the questions and concerns from CPSC staff. And again, Ralph, we're turned down. It seems like where we are as a country, we're turning back. We're not looking forward.
Well, you know, Russell, you got a problem I didn't have because motorists, owned their cars. They were in crashes. There was a personal connection. People don't look at floors. And it's amazing the technology that can reduce the number of serious injuries, slip and fall injuries, and just common sense buying of shoes. I mean, the stiletto heel is an accident waiting to happen. The platform shoe is an accident waiting to happen. The smooth sole and heel, accident waiting to happen. These are much simpler changes than was required even of the auto companies. And still, the flooring industry is opposed, although not entirely. You have some business interests on your side.
Yeah, we have quite a few, actually, non-flooring manufacturers. But, the floor mat industry supports us generally. Manufacturers of floor cleaners are very, very supportive. We've got a lot of support from, insurers. In fact, a new statistic just came out last week. Liberty Mutual just announced that same level slips, trips, and falls cost a workplace $1 billion a week. $1 billion a week in cost of same level slips and falls, and that's just in the workplace. That doesn't include homes, consumers, and as you know, Ralph, the most impacted by fall related injuries and fatalities are the elderly. They're the most vulnerable of our citizens. 34,000 elderly Americans died last year as a result of a fall. 8 million seek emergency room treatment each year for a fall. And those numbers continue to go up, but government just isn't responding. And as an advocate for walkway safety, as you were for automobile safety, it's frustrating how many people are being injured, many of which can be prevented, but also how industry just attacks us repeatedly. I can't tell you, Ralph, how many times I've been to the CPSC where the flooring industry lawyers just line up in, it's like a waiting room of them.
Well, on your side, I think, the more people sue the manufacturers of flooring, and you've been an expert witness in a lot of these cases, the more the cost shift will send a message to these manufacturers that they're going to have to pay out verdicts and settlements. Their insurance is going to go up if they don't get smart and just use existing technology that has, as you say, an adequate coefficient of friction. It's simple mathematics. And the second, you probably need more allies in Congress. And Republicans fall like Democrats. So it shouldn't be a partisan issue. Everybody knows a relative, an elderly person, even a youngster who's fallen, broken a hip, broken a kneecap, and all the expense that comes into it. So the insurance companies should be much more aggressive here on Congress. They got a big lobby on Congress, and they should move.
Right. Well, that's the struggle. And I kind of feel, Ralph, that my struggle was your struggle. We're just separated by about 50 years. One other subject I wanted to talk about before I let you go is the personal interest that you have in the Boeing 737 MAX crisis, the safety issues surrounding that aircraft. Not a lot of people know that you actually had a family member that perished in one of those crashes. Tell us about what happened, Ralph.
Well, it's a sad, very tragic story. At age 24, our grandniece, Samia Rose, was on her way to Africa. She was an emerging leader in global health. She had articles in professional journals published. As I say, she was just 24. Had great leadership skills, on the field compassion, no nonsense, great personal skills, and intellectual rigor. She would be invited to talk to professional conferences around the world on global health. And she was killed in that crash along with 156 other innocent people. And Boeing killed them. This was criminal negligence. The Boeing company, instead of producing a new plane, extended the life of the Boeing 737, which started in 1967, and they built the 737 800 MAX, as they called it, MAX, and in order to compete and catch up with Airbus, they increased the size of their engines for fuel efficiency and attached it to the old fuselage. And they put the engines up and forward and destabilized the engines, the aircraft, so that it was more prone to stall than Boeing would have liked. So Boeing, instead of doing a product fix, they tried to do a software fix. They didn't tell the airlines, they didn't tell the pilots, they didn't fully inform the FAA, they didn't put it in the flight manuals and train the pilots. They wanted to sneak it in, and it was a monster. And over the Java Sea, a crash occurred with about almost 190 deaths in October 2018 because this hidden software was pulling down the nose of the aircraft 21 times, and the pilots didn't even know what was happening, and they kept trying to manually pull it up until they were overpowered by this time bomb software. And in March 10th of this year, this Ethiopian Airlines crash occurred in a similar fashion. And so we're awaiting congressional hearings to get Boeing officials to testify under oath. They still haven't demanded Boeing to do so. Boeing's very powerful in Washington, D.C. It's the only U.S. manufacturer of these kinds of planes. They give campaign cash to 330 out of 535 members of Congress. They throw their weight around, and they own the FAA. So the families are organizing. Recently, they just held a major demonstration that was widely covered in front of the U.S. Department of Transportation. And people were wanting involved in this because you're going to be flying on these airlines. If 400 of them were grounded, but they've got orders for 4,600 more. So if you want to make sure this plane is prohibited from flying at all or made much safer, go to flyersrights.org. That's the consumer group for you, airline passengers, flyersrights.org, and you can get up to date, and maybe you can join other airline passengers and join this wonderful group that's speaking out and watching out for you.
You know, is it always the same story, Ralph? Corporate America finds a problem. They know there was a problem. In fact, in the Boeing case, there were internal whistleblowers, right? There was a lot of Boeing employees that were whistleblowing, and they knew the problem. They take the path of least resistance, the cheap fix. It doesn't work. Again, the same model, right? Is this what they teach at Harvard Law? I mean, here's how you go about building earnings and public safety be damned. I mean, how many people have to die? That's a question I'm always asked. Well, how many people have to get hurt?
Yeah. Well, you know, Boeing was once known as a pure engineering company, merged with McDonnell Douglas, which is a defense manufacturer as well as a competitor for passenger airlines. And it became an investment company. In other words, it was looking for its stock price, which went up huge from $90 10 years ago to $445. It's now down to $360 because of the Boeing crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia. But the Boeing bosses were all concerned about huge pay increases for themselves, buttering up the board of directors just for a few meetings. And members of the board get over $300,000 each a year. And so you're right, they overruled their conscientious engineers who told them, watch out, don't do it this way. A lot of the engineers quit. I've never seen so many aerospace experts blame Boeing for any aircraft crash in modern American history. However, the FAA is in bed with Boeing. The two House and Senate committees have not been stalwarts as they should be. The House committee under Congressman DeFazio should be more active. But a new committee, the subcommittee on FAA's appropriations, the money, is now announced investigations. And the National Safety Transportation Board, which is an independent of the FAA, is going to come out with a report soon. But we're announcing a consumer boycott called Axe the Max, Axe the Boeing Max. We have buttons, and if you go to flyersrights.org, you can get the information and spread the word. The one thing Boeing can't control is you, the airline passenger. Refuse to fly that plane, and you will send them a clear message that that brand is going to be damaged and they better shape up.
Well, I mean, Ralph, isn't this criminal negligence? I mean, there should be some executives going to jail over this. This isn't an oversight. This isn't a minor issue. This was an intentional act by Boeing executives to avoid, because of cost, presumably, public safety, allowing aircraft to be put into operation when they knew there was a serious design flaw that resulted or potentially resulted in fatalities. I mean, where's the law on this, Ralph?
Quite correct. Step by step, it was a post child for criminal negligence. They knew in order to maximize their profits, they were cutting safety corners. They didn't inform the pilots and the airlines that it required training to use the software. They did not disclose their aerodynamic tests that would have revealed the prone to stall problem of the Boeing 737 MAX. And the worst thing is they bulldozed their own engineers and shut them up and covered up the whole process and didn't meet the federal requirement to fully and timely notify the FAA, which is supposed to be their regulator. That is why the Justice Department in May of 2019 has opened a criminal probe, has established an operating grand jury, and I hope in a few weeks or months we'll see how high up they go the Boeing chain to reach the CEO himself, Dennis Muhlenberg, and the board of
absolutely.
directors.
I mean, we see the same thing, and same model, Ralph, same business model, where manufacturers of floors, they know they produce products that have a higher level of performance, safety, coefficient of friction than others, but they don't really want the consumer to know that there is a difference. They want everyone to assume that, well, if you go to the store to buy a floor, they're all safe. That's the presumption that the consumer has, when in reality it's quite different. What was surprising in our petitions to the Consumer Product Safety Commission was how blatantly open the CEOs of the largest flooring manufacturers were. In fact, Ralph, one of the leading manufacturers of ceramic tile, the CEO put in writing that there was no need for testing and labeling of products, that if the consumer wants to know if a particular floor is slippery or not, that all they have to do is rub their hand or fingers over the tile. Somehow that would be a true indicator.
Yeah, it's the same problem. They blamed the driver in the old days completely, instead of the highway design and the auto manufacturers playing an important role. And here in your area, they blamed the pedestrian. It's all the slip and fall person's fault. They weren't looking. They were moving too fast. They had bad shoes. Well, some of that obviously is a factor, but that's not their responsibility. The flooring industry's responsibility is to make the floor as difficult as possible to slip and fall on. And they've had this technology, and it's inexpensive, and it will prevent a lot of paraplegics and quadriplegics, and not just broken ankles and fractured hips, from occurring. And I'm waiting for the first district attorney to file a criminal case against these manufacturers.
Yeah, and I'm actually waiting for what presumably could be a class action lawsuit against manufacturers. They are directly contributing and causing to numerous injuries, fatalities for slips and falls, and again are not held accountable. But I've worked on almost 800 slip, trip, and fall lawsuits representing both plaintiffs and defendants. And Ralph, it never ceases to amaze me that when a defendant wants to, through cross-examination, ask questions of me like, well, Mr. Kensier, the plaintiff was wearing flip-flops, and how do you know she wasn't, watching where she's going? As if people don't watch where they walk. I mean, aside from texting or something like that, most people do watch where they're walking. But a good example is, flip-flops. Flip-flops can be inherently dangerous, especially on wet floors. And, okay, we understand that. But here's the thing is, I'll have cases against major retailers where they'll blame the person wearing flip-flops. And I'll say, well, you know what? Yeah, flip-flops are not safety shoes, but hey, she bought them from you. And I don't recall any label that you put on these dangerous flip-flops warning your customers not to be wearing them, especially in your store. So here you go, blaming the victim, the plaintiff, for a slip and fall wearing flip-flops that you sold her. I mean, which way is it? Are you claiming you sent her sold her an unsafe product that you didn't properly warn? And you know, Ralph, that's the sticky wicket. It's always blame somebody else. It's never the manufacturer's fault. It's always the victim's fault. And that's what we see here. Now, that's not the case in the Boeing lawsuit. They're not blaming the victim, but you know, by golly, who's going to be held accountable at the end of the day? Will government, Ralph, hold people accountable? That's the bigger question.
I think you're going to win your battle with the Consumer Product Safety Commission. A little more pressure from Congress, some hearings, some pressure from the insurance companies, and I think you're going to win it because it's so minimal a sacrifice short term by the flooring industry. They're just being stubborn. They don't want any attention paid to the fact that they are creating an environment where the probability of slipping and falling is higher than it needs to be if they had an actual friction built in to the flooring material. So I think the more you talk this up, the more people read your book, Floored, Real-Life Stories from a Slip and Fall Expert Witness, by the one and only Russell J. Kendzior. I'm telling you, there's no number two. I mean, even the Yankees had a number two. They had Lou Gehrig behind or ahead of Babe Ruth in the lineup. But you will prevail, and the plaintiff lawyers ought to increase the number of lawsuits because that's the way to really send a message and hit these flooring manufacturers in the pocketbook.
Well, we're not giving up, Ralph, and as someone that has been to the Tort Museum and look forward to coming back, in fact, hopefully I'll be coming back as a speaker on the subject, and maybe we could get something in the museum regarding slip and fall issues. I know the museum sells my books, and I appreciate that, and I'll be coming back up. But one more time before I let you go, Ralph, what's the website for the Tort Museum?
Yes, tortmuseum.org. It has the best collection of books on tort cases, real human interest trials of most bookstores in the country. You can order them online, or you can also go to the first inaugural Historic Tort Law Education Day on October 5th, Saturday, between 11 and 5 p.m. Beautiful fall day in rustic New England. You can take the family, and you can get the details by going to tortmuseum.org. And we're looking forward to an event focusing on Russell Kendzior's heroic work on preventing enormous injury and death and medical expenses and family anguish by these preventable slip and fall cases.
I appreciate that, Ralph, and God bless you, and thank you for the work you have done on behalf of public safety for this country, and really can't tell you how much of a role model you have been in my life, and carrying that torch of public safety, which isn't always easy to carry, but it's guys like you, Ralph, that have really given me and inspired me to advance this very, very important subject. So thanks again for everything you've done, Ralph.
Thank you very much, Russell. There's no other way than to work to save human life and prevent injuries.
Well, this has been America's Slip and Fall Guy, Russ Kendzior, and reminding you, don't let your next step be your last step. Until then, take care.